Okay, I think we're recording. Great. Well, oh, just a quick reminder for those of you who just logged in, please mute your your mic on your end unless you are speaking. So on your Zoom platform, there should be a button on your lower left-hand side that says mute. Click on that. Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm happy to introduce everybody to BobBerry, who is the principal UX researcher at Answer Lab. He's also the director of the Human Computer Mastermind Academy, which is an online institute for mastering the art and science of human-computer interface and user experience. I found in one of your websites, it says that you've been involved for a very long time. It says almost 40 years, so this is his words, not mine, within computer science, user experience, and marketing. You know, three disciplines that might sound very different from one another, but have a lot to do with one another and have a lot of very interesting applications to just industry at large and to the professional world. UX is a very engaging and I wouldn't even say emerging. It's here a field, applied field. And just to give you a little aside before letting it off to Bob, since I haven't introduced myself, I'm Professor Jorge Barraza from USC. I'm a professor at the Master's in Applied Psychology program. I'm focused in consumer psychology. My area academically is in the application of neuroscience to understanding consumer behavior. I do this also on the side of consulting, so feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn as well, or through email, which I'll share later as well. But my focus on the consulting side or on the industry side is providing the tools and insights from neuroscience to business problems in different types of industries, whether it's entertainment, marketing, market research, moving into HR in very interesting ways as well. So yeah, but here we are here to hear from Bob's extended expertise. So I'll just hand it over to him, and looking forward to a great conversation.
Thanks, Ron. I really appreciate it. All right,
Great.
I appreciate everybody joining. Thanks for doing this. I have a presentation I want to give you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'll pause from time to time as we go through this to take any questions or if there are any topics that you want me to expand on. I have been doing this a long time, specifically with user experience, about 20 years, but I've been involved in internet, web, computer science, and interactive systems for about twice that long. So what I want to give you is a perspective on what's happening right now. It's a very hot field to be in. There's some really interesting things going on. Share with you some of my experiences. I also, as he mentioned, I do work for Answer Lab, which is, I think, one of the premier user experience companies on the planet. And I'll give you some examples of some of the things that we've been working on lately to give you an idea of the kind of work that we do. So, again, I've been doing speaking, teaching, researching, been an entrepreneur, been involved in some startups, been doing a lot of training. I've been involved in this field in a number of ways for a long time. These are just some of the companies that I am working with now or have worked with in the past. So that's one of the great benefits of being in this field is I get to be on the forefront of what a lot of the top companies in the world are doing today. And in a lot of cases, really get inside their operations and their design works to see what they're up to. And to me, that's one of the most satisfying things about doing this. Again, Bachelor of Science, Computer Science, many years ago. Just a little side note, actually, I was involved in some of the early work at HP when the web first came online back in the early 90s. So we were doing cloud-based services, online ordering, e-learning, online community, which are now, of course, are called e-commerce, social media. We were doing a lot of that stuff before a lot of those terms existed. So it's been a lot of fun being there at the beginning and seeing how much those have evolved over the last 15, 20 years. So used to have a hard time explaining to people what I do, especially people that were not technical. And so I've sort of boiled it down to this. So companies like Apple, Google, HP, FedEx, and a lot of those other ones that I just showed are always creating new stuff. And my job is to learn how well real people can understand and do useful things with those inventions. So I take a lot of those inventions and I put them in front of real human beings and have them try a number of things and see how well they can make sense out of them and whether they have any relevance for their lives. And so we can get into a lot of very esoteric discussions of user experience, but to me, this has been a good way to describe what I'm about. So what I want to do is, this actually is an adapted presentation that I've used to teach about user experience. And so this is derived from that. It has a business focus to convince business people on the power and the usefulness of user experience research and paying attention to what users are doing within the various experiences that they're putting in the world. And so I use this very long title, and it's based on a rather simple but pretty powerful premise, which is that user experience actually enables the next age of civilization, and it drives billions in business around the world for the entire global economy, and it probably is the trigger for most, if not all, of whatever outcomes business people are seeking in the world. And so that's a pretty big claim. I'll unpack that a little bit more as we go through this. So here's some examples. And the single event that I'm talking about here really is user experience. So you can keep that in mind as we go through this. So user experience is capable, as I mentioned, of driving the global economy. And in a minute, I'll take each one of these and describe them in more detail. User experience is also capable of launching entire industries and, in fact, has enabled the next age of civilization. When we study it carefully, user experience is capable of revealing insights that are critical to business missions, business outcomes. And those insights, in many cases, are not available any other way. The only way to get at them is by examining users as they interact with whatever experiences we put in the world. Virtually every customer interaction, and this is online and offline. We do a lot of offline work as well that don't involve websites or apps or technology. Virtually every one of those is driven by and has at the center some form of user experience. Also, there are some examples of cases where when user experience is not done correctly, the outcomes can be very tragic, and I'll share some of those examples. Changes in user experience, innovations in user experience actually have brought down entire multi-billion-dollar multinational companies. I'll share some of that. User experience is certainly what has initiated and drives the vast world of social media. All of the online world that we live in has now gone social, and user experience is at the center of that, and it's actually what initiated it. The top companies, and I listed several of those, so we work with Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, FedEx. They literally spend combined billions of dollars on user research. And because it generates comparable amounts of income for them when they do it right. So they know that it's important. But beyond a lot of those big companies, it's actually ignored by a pretty significant portion of small and medium-sized companies. And so the one single event, of course, is so subtle and so pervasive, so common that most people look right past it. They may not even be aware that it's there, but it's happening all the time. It's happening right now as I'm sharing this presentation with you. And of course, that single event is that guy right there in that picture staring at that, whatever he's staring at on that screen, and that he's about to make a choice. He's about to click on something, or he's about to fill in a form, or he's about to purchase, or whatever he's going to do. He's looking and he's having some experience that somebody has designed that he's encountering through that screen. And in the midst of that, he's about to make a choice. So every click, every call, every transaction, anything that he may or may not do is a function of the experience he's having and the choices that he's going to make, and that is what produces the vast portion of the outcomes. That's why I say user experience drives the global economy, because it's very difficult to think of any kind of transaction that might be included in the global economy that doesn't start with a human being like that guy right there making some decision about taking some action. And the cumulative effect of all of that is our global economy. So that list I just rattled through, let's look at those a little bit more. So this whole premise about the event drives the global economy. This, again, looking at this from a business standpoint, you think of us as business people, we're all focused on delivering some kind of value, creating something useful in the world and getting some kind of payment or fair compensation for that. And again, all of that fair compensation must occur when somebody makes a choice somewhere within the experiences that we put out there. And then again, the global economy is what happens when you add all that up. You know, billions of those happening every day, every minute. And just think about that for a minute. If you're thinking about what user experience might mean and what impact it has and what it might mean for you, it has a, you know, my premise is that it has a very significant impact on what happens in the world today. And so as user experience professionals, if this is true, if our clients are exchanging whatever value they're creating for some fair compensation, you know, getting paid, and all of that fair compensation is people making choices within experiences, and you know, how much do those clients, do those companies, do those businesses know whether those experiences are producing the right choices? And that's really what our profession is about, is helping companies understand whether or not they're creating the right experiences that will help their customers, their prospects, their users make the choices that they want them to make, or that are choices that will be useful to the users, of course. So if much of our clients are successful, the clients that we work with, if their success comes directly from those individual human choices, then the amount of knowledge that they possess about that one event, that one choice that people are making, is pretty important to them. And that's why big companies like the Googles and the Amazons and the Apples and the Facebooks of the world literally hire armies of people to do this and spend so much money, because all of these people that you see here in this screenshot are all making those kind of choices. So that knowledge is power. Knowledge of that experience and what people are doing is power. And of course, the challenge is that it's hidden. When you're running a business, an online business of any kind, you have to make take very specific steps to reveal what's going on in those experiences, because it's largely invisible. And users can be shy. They often are very difficult to drag out. And so we developed these processes, these methods, these professional approaches to getting those users to talk about and show us what they're actually doing and why they're doing it. And that's pretty essential to a lot of people's business success. So this second one, this one about launches entire industries. Let's talk about this one. None of you are probably old enough to remember this. When PCs first came out, they looked like this. This is a screen from a Microsoft DOS. And it was all command line. If you wanted to do anything on the early PCs, you had to go in and type a whole bunch of text commands in order to actually make anything happen. That was back in the early 80s. In the mid 80s, Microsoft introduced this thing called Windows. This is Windows 1.0. And suddenly we had a very different experience. And of course, the different experience was these windows on the screen, as well as this thing called a mouse and point and click. So that change in experience led to the explosion of the personal computer industry, which was the first real huge technology revolution that occurred. And all of that was about a different user experience. Somebody invented a better way of interacting with a computer than typing text commands. Another example, so way back in the 50s, the US Defense Department invented this thing called ARPA, which was a way for the government, mostly the Defense Department and big universities, to share information by connecting computers across great distances. That was actually the precursor to the internet, as you probably have heard a lot of these stories. In 1983, Internet Protocol was invented, which allowed those networks and those computers to communicate a lot more effectively. And then in 1989, this guy named Tim Berners-Lee actually invented the World Wide Web. So a lot of this existed before any businesses or any common person was able to access it. Of course, what happened? In 1983, Mosaic launched this thing called a browser. And again, what's a browser? It's an experience. It's an interface. It's a way for me to interact with these networks and this technology that already existed. So Internet Protocol already existed. World Wide Web already existed. The network already existed. It took Tim Berners-Lee to invent this experience called the browser. And then shortly after that, there was Netscape, and then it just sort of exploded from there. And now everybody knows what a browser is. We all use them, hours every day. And so this experience, this new experience called browsing, basically launched the information age. And back then it was really amazing and new stuff. And today it's, so common we don't even think about it. So again, this third one that I mentioned was the fact that the event being making choices in the experience, reveals mission critical insights not available any other way. And so again, when you sit down, if you've ever done user tests or observed anybody else doing them, when you do them well, what users reveal during that time when they're interacting with that app or looking through that website or trying to figure out that software, whatever it might be, they're going to share insights, or you're going to observe things about what they do or what they fail at that are not available any other way. The only way you're going to locate those insights is through that method. And in many cases, those are critical to success. For those apps and that software, those websites to actually work, they have to be able to provide that kind of insight. And there's a couple contexts here. One is the best experiences reveal critical insights, and then examining those experiences through a usability test or a user session actually reveals insights at the same time. So here's a couple of examples, a couple of real examples. So this one at the top is about a mobile app that a pharmaceutical company launched for heart patients. And in the testing of the app, what we discovered was heart patients were not the right target for the app. The right target was the caregivers for those patients. So a lot of times those patients had a spouse or a son or a daughter or sibling or somebody who was there taking care of them. And those are the people that should have been using the app to keep track of various health factors, doctor visits, medications, things like that. The one below is a very interesting project I did a few years ago where a company was trying to reinvent itself. They were a printed document company. They've been around for 80 years. And with the dawn of the virtual age, then everything was going virtual and their printing business was dying rapidly. So they were buying up a lot of little startups and they were trying to create an internet services business. And what they found was that they were targeting small businesses with these online services, and they found that most small business people couldn't figure this out. So it was a real insight for them to actually see small people businesses struggle and fail with this system, and they learned a lot about how to do it better. So there's just a couple of examples. Another example is, again, this context of revealing critical insights. I work with this company called Future Selves that created a diagnostic tool for at-risk youth. And we used it with college freshmen that were struggling and they were on academic probation. And this diagnostic tool, the experience that it provided, uncovered insights about hopes, fears, self-image that were at the root of why these people were not succeeding in school. And by uncovering these things that the lives these young people didn't even know about themselves, we were able to really develop some interventions and help them become a lot more successful and feel a lot better about themselves. So it was a kind of experience that got at some hidden things in these people's psyche that that really made a key difference. So significant impact there on what experience can do for people. And again, this whole idea, and I've mentioned this before, so I won't really go on about this, but we do all these things on the left in business to try to stimulate people to do things. And then those people are going to respond or not, and those are going to produce some kind of desirable outcome from a business standpoint. So, and again, everything on the left ultimately is going to land somewhere with that lady in the middle having some experience with a device or a laptop or walking into a brick and mortar store or, some other where, she's going to have to make some choice about what she's doing in the context of her experience. And she has to make a choice in that experience for anything on the right to actually occur. And one of the big challenges today with online marketing is that, here's a potential customer that we might want to reach. And you have some message, or a business has some message that they want to share with this person. And what happens is she encounters this. And this is what online marketing looks like in the 21st century. And so it's just that the internet is incredibly crowded and noisy and loud. And in order for companies to sift through this and find out what people are really going to want to react to, what's meaningful to them, user experience is essential to making that happen. Here's another example of bad things that can happen. 3 Mile Island, the partial meltdown back in '79 occurred because of a poor interface with control panels, undifferentiated rows of indicators. Operators missed the warning messages. The USS Vincennes shot down a civilian plane in '79 because the operator confused a tracking cursor on a radar screen with a similar cursor for initiating attack. So that was a user interface error that turned out very tragically. You probably remember this one. This was just last year, where the Hawaii Emergency Management System warned Hawaiian residents that there were incoming nuclear missiles because an operator selected the alert button instead of the adjacent test alert button. And for 45 minutes, residents of Hawaii thought they were under attack. And then the USS John McCain had a collision with a ship, again due to an interface that did not clearly specify who on ship was in charge of control. And the ship was out of control and ended up having a collision with another ship. Here's an interesting one too. You might remember this one. Steve Harvey announced the wrong Miss Universe winner a few years ago because if you ever saw the card he was handed, it wasn't clear on the card who actually was the runner-up and who was the winner. And so in the heat of the moment, he read the wrong one, and it was actually quite humorous. So let me just pause there. Anybody have any questions about anything so far, or any comments about any of the stuff I'm sharing here? So I'll pause at the end too, when people want to comment on or make any questions about any of this. So here's another example. I mentioned earlier that it can bring down, user experience can bring down billion-dollar multinational companies. So everybody probably recognizes this. It's a BlackBerry. I was a CrackBerry addict for a few years. And BlackBerry was by far the most popular smartphone on the planet. But guess what happened? This happened. This, of course, is the early iPhone. And so the touchscreen interface on the iPhone very quickly sank the BlackBerry. At one point, the BlackBerry market share was 37%. Today, it's exactly 0. And it was all because of the better user interface that Steve Jobs and Apple announced with that first iPhone. It was so dramatically different than the experience that people, and not that the BlackBerry experience was bad. I mean, I loved using my BlackBerry, but once I laid hands on an iPhone, forget it, it was over. So I won't go through this in a lot of detail, but if you look at sort of the progression of what happened in the information age, back in the early 90s, early to late 90s, we had a lot of these, these are some of the major brands, AOL especially, Yahoo were big back then. And back then it was all about content. Content was king. And then from the early part of the century until now, the focus shifted from content to social. So now the internet and the web is very much about a lot of the ways that we interact with other people. And again, some of this is for good, and some of it, especially recently, is maybe not so good, and a lot of side effects of the social revolution in technology. So what's coming up? Well, now all these companies are working on artificial intelligence, and pretty soon, and within the foreseeable future, we're all going to live in a highly integrated, ubiquitous, single experience that's going to tie together virtually every aspect of our lives: education, finance, employment, entertainment, home, how you manage your house, what goes on in your car. And all this is going to be integrated. All the data is going to be shared across platforms, and it's going to be mandatory. You can choose to play or not. And it's not like you can opt out some of these. You're either going to play in all, or you're not going to play at all. And not playing at all means you're going to sacrifice some major things in life. And again, this is all about experience. This is all about the upcoming experience that we're all starting to get a taste of. So this has been a very rapid progression from the content age to the social age, and pretty soon now to intelligent experiences, which are going to be predominant from now until, who knows when. So this is very much what our future looks like. Here's another one. I won't go into this in too much detail because there's a lot. I could write an entire paper on this one. But the what Facebook and to a large extent Google and some other companies have accomplished is creating the most efficient advertising engine that's ever existed. And advertising's been around for centuries. It goes way back to, actually for millennia. Advertising is a very old business, but Facebook now has a method that far exceeds anything that's ever been accomplished. And how did that happen? Well, it happened because early on, early Facebook developers and designers recognized that they could create this social system that would trigger brain chemicals that would cause people to want that next like, or to get that next follow, or to be able to see what their friends and family were doing, and then keep coming back and keep sharing more about themselves and keep allowing Facebook to track more and more of their behavior and their preferences. And it's that early addictive brain chemistry triggers that led to Facebook's ability to track people's behavior and then ultimately create the very powerful advertising engine that they have today that generates billions of dollars in income. Now, again, there's a side effect to this, and it's all this, and I haven't updated this in a few weeks, so there's stuff that's come out in the last few days about Facebook that I could add to this. So while this is a truly powerful business engine, it has real impact on our world today, and it's not clear that we've figured this out yet. This is still a work in progress. And so next premise here is that, I mentioned that the event, again, users making choices in their experiences they're having, attracts billions in revenue and investment from the world's top companies. And I speak from experience because I work with these companies. The number of people that they're hiring and the amount of money that they're investing in this is really astounding. And companies like AnswerLab that I work for, we're successful because these big companies cannot hire people fast enough, and they have to outsource a lot of this work. So it's really critical to business today. Here's one example. I did this project for Deluxe Corporation. This has been some years ago. We did user testing on a number of different touch points. We looked at web, email, call center, face-to-face, print, and a lot of stuff. And within a year's time, we were able to actually realize over $3 million in incremental top-line revenue by optimizing all of those, all of it done purely through user testing and integrating these channels and making them a lot more effective and a lot more efficient. And this is a journey map of a typical customer that went through these different touch points. This is one of the key tools that we use if you haven't encountered one of these before. And again, this last one is this big surprise is that a lot of small and medium-sized companies have yet to discover this or have yet to figure out how to invest in it. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is that it can be very expensive. It can be very time-consuming. And a lot of companies don't have the capacity or the funding to make this happen. But it's becoming more and more common. Also, I think a lot of small companies assume that they can design this in. They assume that their developers and designers can make this happen without actually going back and testing and verifying. But in many cases, that is a questionable proposition. But anyway, so here are all these premises again, all these claims that I make. So hopefully through all of that, you can see that user experience truly has a pretty significant impact on what happens around us. And it has a pretty significant impact on the world that we're in, that we've been in, and almost certainly where we're going as well. So again, the question all comes down to, what are they going to do? Companies need to know that. They have to know that in order to succeed. And it's up to us to reveal that, to figure out in a lot of different ways, a lot of different methods that we use. Just looking at these two people staring at computer screens is probably the most common way, but there are lots of other types of experiences that people have. And again, this is a little deceptive because they're sitting there thoughtfully, you know, taking time. You know, most of this stuff happens in split seconds. Most people don't think about a lot of these choices that they make. It happens very quickly. So, you know, what will they do? So those choices are hidden. Online, they're hidden in the user experience of somebody interacting with a website or an app. Offline, they're hidden in the user's mind. If they're walking into a store, you don't really know what's going on, what's making them do what they do. And so it's up to us to figure out how we're going to remove that fog. And here's another example of, I won't go through this, but you know, a small investment in user experience research and applying that repeatedly can realize a significant return on investment for companies. So there's a business case to be made here about why this is important and why this works. So this particular one is, you know, the ROI is 146x based on a small investment in making a small 5% improvement in conversion rates based on making a small investment in user experience testing. And so again, the headline, you know, what if you knew you couldn't fail? You know, this stuff almost always works. And the more you do it, the more it works. It's very useful. And again, as I mentioned, it applies as much to the online world as the offline world. We do a lot of work with brick and mortar, with call centers, with people on the street, with various events and conferences, and there's all sorts of things that happen that are not in an app or a website that have just as much impact. So again, there's a lot that we don't know that might, you know, from a business standpoint, there's a lot that business people may not know that might be standing in the way of their success. And the possibility is that there is a way to reveal those events that are going to improve their success. And you know, what if you were one of these business people and you could finally gain the knowledge necessary, and there's only one way to get that knowledge, and you knew you couldn't fail. And so really that's what our profession, that's what our industry is about. That's what I do. And again, these companies that I've mentioned a few times are all doing this big time. So they know it works. They pour millions into it. This is our ever-growing team at Answer Lab. If you'd like to learn more about the company and what we do, then absolutely let me know. I'd be happy to share more about that. It's a wonderful group of people. You notice that I'm probably the oldest one there. It's a lot of young people, and all very energetic, all very talented, and all working with you know, the top companies on the planet right now. So here are a few examples. I just wanted to throw in a few of these. These are some of the recent work I've done with these three companies. I've fuzzed out some of this just for the sake of confidentiality, but this is an example of one of these companies that has a website that promotes the workshops that they offer in their stores. And there's a lot of workshops that focus on art and health and programming and music and a lot of different topics. So the company does these workshops to try and get people into the store to get them using their devices and their products. And we tested this website with people and they responded very favorably. They really liked the idea of being able to be in a social setting and learn how to use you know, the very expensive stuff that they purchased and how to get into their hobbies more and how to be more creative and express themselves in ways that they cared about. So it was a fun study to do to learn how people might be engaging in the various things that generate passion for them. Here's another example of a social media company that was testing a whole series of ads in a social media stream. You probably have seen this before. These are heat maps generated through eye tracking software. So this was a really challenging study where we actually had to invent some new methods to help this company identify which types of ads would generate the most views, how long did people look at these, where did they click, you know, which types of ad did they notice the most, where did they spend the most time looking. And this was an opportunity for us to actually invent some new research methodologies that we had never used before. So we had to get really creative. So there's certainly a very challenging, you know, sometimes I think there might be an impression that usability and user experience is just sort of turn the crank, but in the work I do, we constantly are tossed challenges by these companies and we have to get really creative and clever on how we're going to solve these. Here's an offline example where a Bay Area company is building like crazy, hiring huge numbers of people and moving them to the Bay Area, which of course is a big problem because there already are huge numbers of people in the Bay Area. So we did a study to help them understand what impact this has on the people they were hiring, what's quality of life, what else can the company do to make their day at work more effective, how can they help with congestion, how can they help with housing, daycare. There's all sorts of things that the company was interested in learning about. These they care a lot about their employees, they care a lot about the people and their happiness, and so this was a really interesting study and really a chance to talk about things other than forms and buttons and content and things like that. It was a way to talk about real people and the lives they led. So that's my story. So open it up for questions or comments or anything that might be on your mind. And if you do have a question, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm Sid, and I just wanted to say, first of all, thanks for doing this. I had a question about one of your earlier examples.
Yep.
When you were talking about the BlackBerry versus the iPhone, I can remember being in middle school, and the most popular phone for kids to have was like the kind with the slide out like keyboard. Like that was like there were touchscreen phones at the time before the iPhone, but I think like that was considered the coolest type of phone. And I'm not saying that that's like better in any way, but I do feel like the iPhone's like marketing and the fact that it was Apple like played a big part in people like thinking that the experience of better. So I guess my question is like in user experience, how much of that experience do you think is like based on like marketing and perceptions, and how much of it is like an objective thing?
I think that's a good point. I think a lot of it is marketing. I think if you go back to what BlackBerry did, a lot of their marketing was pretty clunky. It was kind of geeky. And I think it appealed more to the geeky crowd. Whereas, and I still work with Apple today, and even to this day, their marketing is, I think, is a world apart. The quality of the graphics and the music and the images and the messaging is everything. It's just completely different than what you experience with almost any other company. So, and the fact that Steve Jobs was one of the most charismatic people in the world at the time, was out there marketing it as well, I think made a huge difference. So yeah, absolutely. The marketing made a big difference, and still, I think still does to this day. So good question. Thank you for that. Yeah, so, and really more than even marketing, it's the brand is really everything. When you think of Apple and you think of BlackBerry, what those two brands conjure very significantly different. And we do a lot of testing around that too. I just recently did a branding test where we were evaluating what people think of with different brands and what they associate with brands and which brands they trust, et cetera. So, there's no limit to the kinds of things that we can study in this field.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Paul.
Hey, Paul.
And I wanted to ask, when like you recommend all these strategies or like the experiences they need to fix, like to the companies, how do the companies go about like implementing those changes? Do you see like they struggle implementing your vision, or how does that work?
So a lot of the companies that I've mentioned work with us on an ongoing basis, and so these are long-term contracts, and so the user testing, the reports and the recommendations that we write, and then how they implement those is not an event; it's a process. And so, for example, with Google and Apple, I've done many phases of ongoing projects. So you'll study an app or a website and make recommendations, and they'll go back and implement those, and then at some future time they'll come out and retest it. And it's very gratifying because you can see that the insights that you revealed, recommendations that you make, they took to heart and they actually implemented them. And again, that's how these companies, that's how Amazon gets to be a multi-billion-dollar global company, is because they just never stop doing this. They're always doing it. It's just as common for them as it is just to put products out there. This is just a way that they operate.
Thanks.
Yep.
I have a question.
Okay.
So actually the touchscreen was invented like 30 years ago, but it didn't take off actually until the iPhone was introduced. So do you think that like the user experience can be a tool to predict whether a new technology will take off, or it will like, it's a time like that the new technology will take off or not?
I don't know. That's a good question. And I think there probably are other examples in here as well. So, I'll go back to the example that I used with Windows. There were other companies experimenting with Windows types of interfaces before Microsoft launched it. And I think in a lot of time, actually, I'm just reading a book now on the history of the iPhone. And it's interesting to hear how a whole variety of different things kind of came together for the iPhone to really be a success. So yeah, there were touch screens. The other thing that the iPhone brought to the public was this whole idea of gestures. So it wasn't just the fact that you could touch the screen, it was how you touched the screen. They invented a whole new way, like of the scrolling and the expanding and contracting and pinching, and there was this whole series of gestures that they added to the touch screen that made it a whole different, again, it's a whole different kind of experience. But anyway, to get to your question, is it a way to predict? I don't know. That's a really good question, because I think sometimes these things converge in ways that you don't see coming. A lot of these things existed before, and there's at some point there's a tipping point. So I guess the answer to your question is, I would say no. It's probably very hard to predict. There's just all the right things have to come together. And with the iPhone, it wasn't just touchscreen and gestures. It was, the miniaturization of memory. It was a lot of the other circuits and devices that they put in the iPhone, that like GPS and the camera, and there's lots of other things that came together in the iPhone that made it a total package. So yeah, I'd say it's actually pretty hard to predict. I mean, it certainly can reveal a lot, but as far as being predictable, I'm not sure that's a sure thing. Good question.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. From what I recall, yeah, there were some touchscreens in the 80s. I remember recently I noticed something about a watch that had a touchscreen, but the issue with that was that the user experience itself wasn't that great, right? It wouldn't work all the time. So there are these times where technologies are not so well developed to provide users enough to let go of what they're already used to for so long, right?
Yeah.
At a certain point, there's not enough motivation to leave that. Why leave that? And I think with the iPhone, like Bob said, there was just so much there that users were willing to leave the BlackBerry. I'm old enough or young enough to remember the internet in the 90s and how it was terrible. It was awful. But at the same time, there was no BlackBerry equivalent at the time. That's what you had to deal with. So of course you dealt with it, and there was enough resources, enough people there to keep wanting to make that better. No, excellent question. Are there any other questions from the group?
Yeah, I have a question. So I was wondering if you could go through some of the major phases of your research process, and sort of what a report to a big company like Apple or Facebook or Microsoft would look like, and what sort of measures do they look for as well?
So that's a really good question, and that's probably enough for a whole other talk. But let me see if I can summarize that. So there's usually up front, there's usually a discovery planning phase where we try to identify what is the client's objectives. What are they? What are they testing? What outcomes are they looking for? And it might be we want to improve conversion rate through through an online shopping cart, for example. Take that as a fairly common one. And so then there's usually a sort of a planning and preparation process after the initial discovery, where we look at prototypes, for testing prototypes, or we look at a live site if we're looking at a live site, and we begin to identify what's the methodology. How are we going to actually find out what is causing this to not have the level of conversions that we want? And then we go and we typically then we have to set up a lab of some kind. Sometimes we test at one of our facilities. We have our own labs in our offices. Sometimes we hire out to a professional facility, depending on what community we're in. And sometimes we do it remotely. We do a lot of remote testing, where I sit here at my desk and I interact just with people just like I'm interacting with you now through Zoom. So we get that all set up and get all the prototypes where we want, and we've got a script written or a research plan written on what we're going to do. And then we actually conduct the sessions where we have something that's maybe loosely scripted or tightly scripted. It sort of depends on the objectives. And usually an absolute minimum number of sessions is going to be 6. And those can go up to literally hundreds, depending on what we're testing and what the objectives are. And then throughout those sessions, we're doing a lot of observing. This is mostly what I'm describing now as qualitative testing. There really isn't much in the way of quantitative in this. Quantitative is a whole other discussion. And then there's a lot of methodologies that you can apply during those sessions to get users to interact, to really assess what's going on with that interface that may be causing problems, providing them alternative prototypes to see whether they're any more successful, and interviewing them about their lives and how they might use this and what context is it relevant, and I can just go on and on. And then usually immediately after the sessions are done, we issue a headline report, which is like a top 10. These are the 10 most critical findings that we uncovered through these set of sessions that we ran. And then we'll go off usually for, on average, a couple of weeks and sort of lock myself away, and I'll take all this data that we've gathered and we'll write a pretty detailed report. And these reports are anywhere from, I just did one that was almost 200 pages. That's pretty big. Most of them are less than 100. And we provide a lot of video examples, screenshots, user quotes, and very specific findings on what users did at various points in the interface based on the tasks that we assigned them. And those reports often include recommendations as well. So users got stuck here for these reasons. We recommend making these changes so that users can be more successful with that part of the interface. And that, a 100-page report might include 40 or 50 of those kind of recommendations. And then we typically present it to the client, either in person or in a remote session like this on Zoom. And then it's up to them to decide what they're going to go do with it. And again, in our case, because we work with clients on an ongoing basis, they will often go off and implement some portion of it and come back and retest to make sure that they haven't broken something else, or that the changes that they made actually did what they were supposed to do. So that's a 2-month, 3-month project in 4 minutes or whatever I just took. Does that help?
Thank you. Yeah.
Great question. Any other questions from our group?
Hi, I'm Nancy. Thank you for doing this today. I actually had 2 questions. One is about the nature of design in terms of, are we trying to make sustainable designs in a world that's changing constantly? And my second one was more about the ethics of UX, like you said about social media. We're seeing like intentionally bad user experiences in order to trick users and sort of manipulate them to do things that the client wants or the corporations want. And so how do we change that culture in terms of people who are designing things for customers, as well as how do we sort of legislate this and sort of kind of punish people who do things that kind of trick users and customers? So yeah, I know it's a lot. Both questions are a lot, but yeah.
Those are 2 very good questions, very big questions. Let me take a brief run at both of them. So the first one on, I think what you were asking is, are there a set of design standards that make sense as fast as the world and technology is changing today? Is that accurate?
Yeah, but like, is it even possible to make something timeless in terms of design now? Because needs are changing, and
I think in most cases, no, because largely because the devices through which we interact change so rapidly. So right now, obviously the big new device that's coming is voice, which of course has no visual, there's no screen at all. So if you had asked me that question 5 years ago, I probably would have went on and on about a whole lot of visual elements. But now with all these voice devices on our wrists, in our pockets, in our cars, in our homes, in the public. You know, everything we now thought was so common and so standard from the standpoint of visual interface is gone, goes away. And we have to completely redesign how machines interact with people based on voice. So now, again, there are some standards that we developed in visual interfaces that do carry over to voice. So there are some best practices, and there are some fairly universal standards that over time are probably not going to go away. But in general, most of it will evolve and change. The second question, I think, is a much harder question, and it's one that I actually care a lot about. If you watched any of the recent interactions between some of our tech leaders and our Congress, it's kind of scary because our legislators, our politicians, our laws are hopelessly out of date, and the technology is moving much faster than our ability to control it and legislate it. And every day there's something new. And I mean, just in the last week, there's just been some incredible things that have happened in the world that our laws can't even touch. You know, and then it's interesting, I thought interesting today was just, I was having a dialogue with a colleague this morning about what laws are there actually any laws you can enforce? And then there was this announcement today that the Department of Housing and Urban Development is going after Facebook because Facebook allows people to discriminate when posting ads for housing, which is against the law. So you can, if you want to rent an apartment, you can go on Facebook and you can decide who's going to see that ad or not, based on race and age and where they live, et cetera, which is clearly against the law. And I mean, obviously, Facebook didn't design their interface to discriminate, but that's one of the side effects. So there's one case where we do have laws that may apply, but I think that's actually more the exception than the rule.
Right.
So.
Yeah, so I'm a psychology major, so this is why it's like so interesting to me in that like sometimes design can undermine human behavior and sort of kind of take out the best abilities we have. And it's interesting because a corporation that wants to do that can hire any designer possible, and it's a competition between designers whether or not they want to do this work, right? So I think the harder thing is like to change the culture amongst designers and people who are in UX that what this is wrong. And I think I wouldn't know how that would change in this sort of working culture.
Yeah, that's really hard because even if you can change the culture of the designers that have ethics, that have a conscience, there's still going to be a significant number of people that don't have ethics and a conscience that are going to find ways to manipulate this to their own advantage, and it's still going to hurt people. So it's a social problem that's not going away for sure. Good questions. Thank you.
Great.
Good dialogue, everybody. Appreciate all the questions. That's great.
Yeah. Any other questions?
So I had a question. I was wondering, kind of a different direction now, how you got into UX and what you would recommend to someone trying to get into UX now.
So that's actually a funny story. So my background is in computer science. So I've been around computers for a long time, as I've shared some of my stories. And actually got into UX because I was working for a little startup back in the late 90s. And there was we had a huge usability project we were doing for Hewlett Packard. And the person that was running it was really doing a really poor job, and that it was about to go down in flames. And I got thrown into it. Somebody said, you have to take this and fix it, because if not, we're going to lose this account, this Hewlett Packard account. And it was sort of like rolling out into the middle of the lake and throwing me in. And I had been around user experience. I had hired usability people before, and I'd seen it, but I'd never run a study before. So I was just sort of handed this and had to figure it out. And so that's how, weird story, but that's how I learned it. So that was a long time ago.
Thank you.
Great.
More questions?
I have a quick question. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I just was curious, you talk about how you kind of work with companies on a rolling basis. And of course, interfaces and things evolve over time, sometimes with just small changes. And you mentioned that a lot of times maybe they'll implement a few things and then come back to make sure nothing else got messed up. So I'm curious kind of what dictates the time frame of when companies decide that they want to do another round of testing on an iteration of their interface.
Oh, there's a lot of factors that go into that. A lot of times it's back-end systems, because in many cases we're working with front-end, with public-facing stuff, and all of those public-facing systems are tied to massive legacy systems for inventory management and processing transactions and and managing vast quantities of data, et cetera, or regulatory and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of times the constraint is on the back end, where they wish they could update the customer-facing stuff faster, but they're so limited by legacy systems that it takes a lot longer. And it's same kind of things we all deal with. What's the budget? How many resources do we have? What else is competing for those kind of things? So it's usually those kind of, it isn't necessarily directly what's happening in the interface. It's all kinds of stuff around it. That's the limiting factor in a lot of cases.
Thanks.
Yep.
Okay, so I have a question.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, okay, I'm John. I have a question about like user experience and UI design, like how they interact with one another. And is that like, do you think that they go hand in hand, or can someone be a UX researcher without being proficient in design as well?
So that's a good question. Somebody needs to mute.
I think that's you, John.
Oh.
So if you're a researcher, you absolutely have to have a good sense of design, because again, we're in a position where we have to make recommendations on changes that need to occur, and we have to design studies. There's a whole lot of things that we need to do, so we need to have a good working knowledge of user design principles. However, with AnswerLab, the company I work for, we intentionally do not do design. We are pure research. And we do that on purpose because we believe that provides by far the most objectivity. I work for companies that did both, and the concern is that on the research side, what you recommend is colored by your desire to win the next design project. And so if you do pure research, then you're not, I might use the word tainted by trying to win new business. So we try to keep it research. We do keep it research only. So it's purely research.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yep.
All right, wonderful.
So you mentioned that part of your report includes making recommendations to the companies. So how do you go about translating insights from your research into design recommendations? Is it stuff that the users explicitly said, or is it something that you're coming up with?
Yeah, in most cases, we try to couch everything in the context of what the users encountered. On occasion, we may footnote a report and say something to the effect of, this researcher observed that this particular form had a functional problem that the users didn't notice, and it seemed to create problems for them, just as an example. But 99% of the time, we couch all of the findings in the context of what users did and said, or what they struggled with. And again, we provide a lot of evidence around that. We show screenshots, we show video examples, we use user quotes, we describe how some number of users tried to interact with whatever and were successful or not. So we try to keep it as objective as possible.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
This is kind of more of a personal question, but kind of going off of Rachel's question about how you got into UX. Can you tell us about your the first company you worked with, if you remember?
So I worked for my early part of my career. I worked for Hewlett Packard for a lot of years, for 15 years. I was a product manager and a business manager at HP. and we designed instruments, scientific instruments. And we hired usability experts pretty frequently to come in and evaluate user interface for scientific instruments. So again, I knew about it, and I was around it a lot as a consumer of it, but I had never actually run a project until that one I described. And then after that, I discovered that I liked it. It was actually, it was fun. I thought it was a lot of fun. And so then for that little company I was working for, where they asked me to take on that project, I actually did. That was a little startup that was in Denver in the late 90s. And I actually ended up doing a number of other usability projects for them after that first one. Does that help? Okay, cool, thanks.
Do we have anybody else? All right, well, thanks to Bob for such a wonderful presentation. Thanks to everybody, especially I'll say it's always exciting to see when students have questions and have very, very good questions. I think you all asked very deep and insightful questions that I was interested in hearing the answer to as well. So thanks for that. This presentation, it was recorded, so I'll send over to Dr. Neubauer. That way you can have that for reference. But other than that, thanks for having us and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you again to Bob, and see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Good evening.